Life Stories brings you another heartfelt tale of resilience, compassion, and the power of second chances. In a quiet diner on the verge of closing, one act of kindness sparks a journey that transforms lives and a community forever. Jake, a struggling diner owner, meets Mike and his daughter Lily, two strangers seeking shelter from the rain. What starts as a simple offer of help unfolds into a story of love, hope, and the fight to belong. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey of perseverance, unexpected friendships, and the profound impact of standing together. Let's dive into this inspiring story now. The rain fell in relentless sheets that evening, its rhythmic patter against the diner windows adding a hollow soundtrack to my thoughts. I stood behind the counter, staring at the cracked linoleum floor of Jake's Classic Eats, a place I had poured my life into for over 2 decades. The neon sign outside, once a proud declaration of the diner's identity, flickered erratically, as if it too had lost hope. Business had been dwindling for years, with newer, trendier spots pulling away my regulars, and the bills stacked on the counter beside me painted a grim picture of what lay ahead. I knew what needed to be done. I would have to sell the place. Yet, who would want to buy a failing business in a neighborhood that had seen better days? My diner wasn't just a building, it was a piece of me, a reflection of the dreams I had once nurtured. Letting it go felt like giving up on more than just a paycheck, it felt like giving up on myself. As I wrestled with my thoughts, the rain intensified, and a flicker of movement outside caught my eye. 2 figures huddled in the alleyway beside the diner, barely visible under the flickering street lamp. A man and a young girl, the latter clutching a threadbare coat tightly around her small frame. They were soaked through, shivering, and utterly out of place in the cold, unforgiving night. My first instinct was to look away. After all, I had enough problems of my own. But as the girl leaned closer to the man, presumably her father, something in her small, fragile frame tugged at me. Her vulnerability was a stark contrast to the weariness etched on his face. A deep pang stirred in my chest, something I hadn't felt in years, guilt, or maybe compassion, though I wasn't ready to admit it. Grumbling under my breath, I grabbed an umbrella and stepped outside. The cold rain bit at my skin as I approached them. "Hey," I called out, sharper than I intended. "What are you doing here?" The man looked up, his expression a mixture of weariness and resignation. "We're just trying to stay out of the rain," he replied, his voice calm but laced with desperation. "We'll leave if we're bothering you." The girl glanced up at me, her wide eyes filled with an innocence that stood in stark contrast to their situation. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, and the way she clung to her father's side spoke volumes about their shared struggle. I hesitated, my gaze shifting between them and the warm, empty diner behind me. "Come inside," I said abruptly, the words surprising even me. The man's eyes widened. "Are you sure? We don't want to cause trouble. Just for tonight," I muttered, almost as if convincing myself. "Stay out here any longer, and the kid's going to catch pneumonia." Without waiting for a response, I turned and headed back inside, leaving the door ajar behind me. Moments later, I heard their hesitant footsteps, followed by the quiet creak of the door as they entered. The warmth of the diner enveloped them, and for the first time that evening, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. They stood awkwardly near the door, water pooling at their feet. The man helped the girl out of her soaked coat, revealing her thin frame and a dress that was clearly too small for her. I busied myself behind the counter, pretending not to notice their discomfort. "Sit wherever you want," I muttered, gesturing vaguely toward the booths. "There's coffee and water by the window." "Thank you," the man said softly, his gratitude evident in his voice. The girl, however, was less reserved. "Thank you so much, sir," she exclaimed, her voice bright and full of life despite her circumstances. "This place is really nice." I grunted in response, unwilling to engage. As they settled into a booth, the man poured himself a cup of coffee while the girl pressed her face against the window, mesmerized by the rain. The hours dragged on in relative silence. I busied myself with cleaning and paperwork, occasionally stealing glances at the pair. The man, who introduced himself as Mike, was quiet and guarded, his every movement careful and deliberate. The girl, Lily, was his opposite, a whirlwind of curiosity and energy. She peppered me with questions about the diner, its history, and the people who used to come here. Against my better judgment, I found myself answering her. I told her about how I had opened the place 20 years ago, back when the neighborhood was thriving. I spoke of the regulars who had once filled the booths and the late-night crowds that had kept the diner alive. She listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern when I explained how things had changed. "Why don't they come here anymore?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. The question caught me off guard. "People change," I said finally, struggling to keep my tone neutral. "Neighborhoods change. I guess this place just isn't what it used to be." Lily nodded solemnly, her expression far too understanding for someone so young. As the night wore on, I couldn't help but see something familiar in the way Mike and Lily leaned on each other. They reminded me of my daughter, Emily, though I hadn't seen her smile like Lily's in years. The weight of that thought pressed heavily on me, and I found myself avoiding their gazes as midnight approached. "You can stay in the storage room for the night," I said gruffly, breaking the silence. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry." Mike looked stunned. "We really don't want to impose. Just take it," I snapped, my tone leaving no room for argument. "Thank you," Mike said again, his voice heavy with emotion. Lily beamed at me. "You're the best, Mr. Jake," she declared with unbridled enthusiasm. I waved her off, retreating to my office to escape the weight of their gratitude. But as I sat at my desk, staring at the mountain of unpaid bills, I couldn't shake the image of Lily's smile. For the first time in months, the crushing weight on my shoulders felt just a little lighter. Yet as I leaned back in my chair, a gnawing thought crept into my mind. I had no idea what I'd just gotten myself into. Morning came with the first weak rays of sunlight filtering through the grimy diner windows. The booths, once filled with the chatter of regulars, sat silent, their polished surfaces reflecting the muted golden glow. I stood behind the counter nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, my mind replaying the events of the previous night. Sleep had been elusive, my thoughts caught between the image of Lily's beaming smile and the growing pile of financial burdens on my desk. I glanced toward the storage room door. Letting them stay had been an impulsive decision, one I wasn't sure I wouldn't regret. When the door creaked open, Mike stepped out cautiously, his posture tense like a man expecting confrontation. Lily followed close behind, her small frame practically vibrating with energy. "Good morning, Mr. Jake," she chirped, bounding over to the counter with a smile that could melt stone. I grunted in response, keeping my focus on the coffee in my hands. "Morning." Mike approached more hesitantly, his voice low and apologetic. "Thanks again for letting us stay last night. It meant a lot." "Don't mention it," I muttered, waving him off. "Just try not to get in the way today." Mike nodded, understanding the unspoken boundaries. But Lily had other ideas. She flitted around the diner with boundless energy, her curiosity spilling into every corner. As I prepared the tables for the day, she peppered me with questions. "How long have you had this place? Did you always want to be a chef? Do you ever get bored being here all day?" My patience, already thin from lack of sleep, began to wear down. "Kid, don't you have something better to do?" Lily tilted her head thoughtfully, her bright eyes locking onto mine. "Not really, but I can help. I'm really good at setting tables." Before I could protest, she grabbed a handful of napkins and began meticulously arranging them on the tables, humming a cheerful tune. Despite myself, I felt a small smile tug at the corners of my mouth. Her enthusiasm was infectious, though I would have died before admitting it. Mike watched from a distance, his expression a mix of pride and worry. "She's always been like that," he said softly, as if reading my thoughts. "Full of energy, no matter what life throws at her." I glanced at him, noting the weariness in his face, the lines etched deep into his skin. "How long have you two been out on the streets?" Mike hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "A little over a year," he admitted. "It's been hard, but we manage." I didn't press further. Something about the way he spoke told me he wasn't ready to share the full story. And I wasn't about to pry. Instead, I busied myself with the morning preparations, occasionally glancing at Lily as she darted from table to table like a whirlwind. As the morning wore on, a few regulars trickled in, their faces etched with suspicion as they noticed Mike and Lily. One of them, Hank, a burly construction worker with a penchant for grumbling, settled into his usual spot at the counter. His gaze flicked toward Mike, then back to me. "What's with the new help, Jake?" he asked, jerking his thumb toward Mike. "They're just staying here for a bit," I replied curtly, hoping to avoid further questions. Hank snorted. "Better watch your stuff. People like that, you never know what they'll take." I felt my jaw tighten, but I didn't respond. Instead, I busied myself behind the counter, pretending not to notice the icy stares Hank directed at Mike. Mike, for his part, remained calm, keeping his focus on Lily. She had taken it upon herself to refill Hank's coffee, her bright smile unwavering despite his cold demeanor. "Here you go, sir," she said cheerfully, placing the coffee pot back on the counter. Hank muttered something unintelligible, refusing to meet her eyes. The interaction left a knot of discomfort in my chest. I knew Hank wasn't the only one in the neighborhood who harbored such prejudices, and I couldn't deny that I myself had shared similar thoughts in the past. But seeing Lily's genuine kindness met with disdain stirred something unfamiliar in me, a desire to defend her. By the time Hank left, the diner had fallen silent again. Mike approached the counter, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "Thanks for not saying anything back there." "What good would it have done?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "People like Hank aren't going to change their minds because of a few words." Mike nodded, his expression unreadable. "Maybe not. But it's still hard to just stand there and take it." I didn't respond, the weight of his words lingering long after he returned to his booth. That evening, as I prepared to close up, Mike approached me again. "I know you've already done more than enough for us," he began carefully, "but I'd like to help out around here. If you'll let me. I used to cook, back when I had steady work." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "You're saying you know your way around a kitchen?" Mike smiled faintly. "I do. I could even prove it, if you want." I hesitated, torn between my instinct to say no and my curiosity. Finally, I sighed. "Fine. Make one dish. If it's any good, maybe I'll let you help out." Mike nodded, rolling up his sleeves. "Deal." I watched from the doorway as he moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, selecting ingredients and working methodically. The aromas that began to fill the air were unlike anything I'd ever cooked myself, rich, warm, and enticing. When he presented the finished dish, I reluctantly took a bite. The flavors exploded on my tongue, leaving me momentarily at a loss for words. "Well?" Mike asked, a hint of nervousness in his tone. "It's not bad," I admitted gruffly. Mike chuckled, recognizing the grudging compliment for what it was. "Glad to hear it." That night, as I locked up the diner, the memory of the meal lingered. For the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the diner, but for the unlikely duo I'd let into my life. Yet deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one I hadn't yet begun to understand. The following morning, the diner seemed lighter. almost as though the place itself could feel the subtle shift in energy. For once, it wasn't just my heavy footsteps echoing in the empty dining area. Mike was already up, wiping down the counters with a diligence I hadn't expected. And Lily was humming softly to herself as she swept the floor with more enthusiasm than skill. I couldn't help but smile at the sight of her, so small, yet so determined to help. "Careful with that broom, kid," I called out. "You're going to knock something over." "I'm a professional cleaner now, Mr. Jake," she replied with mock seriousness, her face lighting up with pride. "No accidents here. Professional." "Huh," I muttered under my breath, but the twitch at the corner of my mouth betrayed my amusement. Mike looked up from the counter, catching the exchange with a faint smile of his own. There was a quiet gratitude in his expression that he didn't voice, but I could see it in the way he moved, like a man determined to repay a kindness he hadn't expected. As the morning wore on, a steady trickle of customers began to fill the diner. The usual faces were there: Hank, who glared at Mike every time he passed; Mrs. Atkins, who always ordered the same plain omelette and coffee, and a few others whose routines were as predictable as the sunrise. But even with the familiarity of the crowd, there was a tension in the air. People noticed Mike in the kitchen, his steady movements as he prepped the ingredients and cleaned with precision. They noticed Lily, too, darting from table to table with a cheerfulness that was impossible to ignore. "Who's the new cook?" Mrs. Atkins asked as I poured her coffee. "Just someone helping out," I replied curtly, hoping to end the conversation there. "Whom?" she murmured, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took a bite of her omelette. "Well, this is better than usual. Maybe you should keep him around." It was the first compliment the food had received in weeks, and though her tone was as sharp as ever, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. Mike was proving himself in a way I hadn't expected. But not everyone shared Mrs. Atkins' begrudging approval. Later that morning, a group of teenagers loitered near the door, their laughter sharp and mocking as they watched Lily dart past with a tray of glasses. I stepped outside, my patience already worn thin. "You kids need something? Or are you just here to stare?" One of them smirked, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Just checking out the new staff, Mr. Jake. Didn't know you were hiring." "Keep moving," I snapped, my tone leaving no room for argument. They laughed as they wandered off, but the unease in my chest lingered long after they were gone. Inside, Lily stood near the counter, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Did I do something wrong, Mr. Jake?" I shook my head, forcing a smile. "No, kid. You didn't do anything wrong. Don't worry about them." Her small shoulders relaxed, and she returned to her work with the same enthusiasm as before. But I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. It made my stomach churn. That evening, as the last customer left and the closed sign was flipped, Mike approached me. "I wanted to thank you," he began, his voice careful, "for giving us a chance." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "Don't read too much into it. The diner needed the help." "Even so," he said, his gaze steady, "you didn't have to. And you're putting up with a lot because of us." I shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude in his tone. "It's not just because of you. This place hasn't been right for a long time. You're just helping me figure out what it needs." He nodded, but his expression was thoughtful. "Still, I know not everyone's happy we're here. They'll get over it," I said firmly, though even I wasn't convinced. "Besides, you're a damn good cook. They'll come around." He smiled faintly. "You really think so?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I do." The next day, Mike suggested adding a new dish to the menu, a simple recipe he'd perfected during his years as a sous chef. At first, I resisted. The regulars were already wary of change, and introducing something new felt like courting disaster. But as I watched Mike work in the kitchen, his movements precise and practiced, I realized there was no harm in trying. When the first plate left the kitchen, I felt my stomach twist with nerves. Mrs. Atkins was the first to try it. And as she took her first bite, I held my breath. "Well, I'll be damned," she muttered, her fork hovering mid-air. "This is good. Real good." The compliment spread through the diner like wildfire. Customers started asking about the dish. And before long, Mike was swamped with orders. The diner buzzed with a kind of energy I hadn't felt in years, a hopeful hum that seemed to push back against the weight of the past. That night, as we locked up, Lily skipped around the empty tables, her smile brighter than ever. "Mr. Jake, today was the best day ever. Can we do it again tomorrow?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "We'll see, kid. We'll see." As Mike and Lily headed to the storage room for the night, I stood behind the counter, staring out at the now empty diner. For the first time in months, the quiet didn't feel suffocating. Instead, it felt like the calm before something new, something better. But deep down, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change was coming, whether the neighborhood liked it or not. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to fight for it. By the end of the week, Jake's Classic Eats felt like a different place. The hum of the refrigerator, once the only sound in the mornings, now mingled with the rhythm of kitchen work and Lily's cheerful chatter. Mike's new dishes were a hit with some customers, though others weren't so sure. The regulars, accustomed to the same menu for years, viewed the changes with a mix of curiosity and resistance. The tension was most palpable when Hank walked in one afternoon, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. He took his usual seat at the counter, his expression sour as he glanced toward the kitchen where Mike was working. "What's this I hear about some fancy new food on the menu?" Hank grumbled, waving a hand at the chalkboard that listed the daily specials. I busied myself wiping down the counter. "It's not fancy. Just something new Mike's been working on." Hank snorted. "Didn't know this was some kind of charity kitchen now." My patience, already worn thin by a busy morning, snapped. "His not charity, Hank. His helping out. And if you don't like it, there's the door." Hank stared at me for a moment, clearly taken aback. Then he huffed and turned his attention to his coffee. "I'll stick to the regular menu. Thanks." The exchange left a sour taste in my mouth, but I pushed it aside. I had bigger things to worry about. The diner was finally starting to draw more customers, but the tension in the air lingered. It was as if the neighborhood couldn't decide whether to embrace the changes or reject them outright. That evening, as I prepared to close up, a sharp crash from outside made me jump. I rushed to the door and found one of the front windows shattered, a brick lying on the floor amidst the shards of glass. Mike appeared beside me, his face hardening as he took in the damage. "What happened?" "Just some punks," I muttered, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The vandalism felt too deliberate, too pointed. Lily peeked around the corner, her wide eyes full of fear. "Did someone break the window, Mr. Jake?" I crouched down to her level, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "It's okay, kid. We'll fix it." She nodded, but her small hands gripped the edge of her dress tightly, betraying her nerves. We spent the next few hours cleaning up the mess. By the time the last shard of glass was swept away, exhaustion had settled into my bones. Mike leaned against the counter, wiping his forehead with a towel. "They're not going to stop, are they?" he said quietly. I shook my head. "Probably not." Mike's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Lily had fallen asleep in one of the booths, her small frame curled up under a blanket. Watching her, I felt a pang of guilt. This wasn't her fight, but she was caught in the middle of it anyway. The next morning, I arrived at the diner to find fresh graffiti sprayed across the walls. Words like "go back where you came from" and other slurs that made my stomach churn. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the hateful words, wondering if this was worth it. But then I thought of Lily's smile, the way she lit up the diner with her energy, and I knew I couldn't back down. Mike arrived a few minutes later, his face darkening as he saw the graffiti. "This has to stop," he said, his voice low and controlled. "It will," I replied, grabbing a bucket of soapy water and a scrub brush. "We'll make it stop." We spent the day scrubbing the walls and repainting where necessary. A few customers stopped by to offer help, their quiet support a small comfort amidst the hostility. By evening, the diner looked clean and welcoming again. But the weight of the day hung heavy over all of us. As I locked up for the night, Mike approached me. "I've been thinking," he began carefully. "Maybe we should leave. Find somewhere else to start fresh." I turned to him, startled by the suggestion. "Leave? You've barely started here. Mike. You're the reason people are coming back." He shook his head. "I'm also the reason this place is a target." "That's not your fault," I said firmly. "And it's not Lily's either. The people doing this, they're the problem. Not you." Mike's expression softened, but the doubt lingered in his eyes. "I just don't want to make things harder for you." "You're not," I said, my voice steady. "In fact, you're making it easier. So don't even think about leaving." Mike didn't reply, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. For now, at least, he was staying. That night, as I sat alone in the diner, staring out at the darkened street, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the verge of something big. The diner was more than just a business now. It was a symbol, a place where people like Mike and Lily could find a second chance. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that away. But deep down, I knew the fight was far from over. The challenges we'd faced so far were just the beginning. And if we were going to make it, we'd have to be ready for whatever came next. The next few days passed in a haze of unease and determination. The graffiti was gone, the window repaired. But the scars left by those hateful actions lingered in the air. Mike worked tirelessly in the kitchen, perfecting new dishes and keeping his head down. Lily was her usual cheerful self, but even her boundless energy seemed more deliberate, as though she sensed the tension and was trying to counter it with her optimism. I could feel the divide in the neighborhood every time a customer walked through the door. Some regulars offered quiet words of encouragement, their loyalty clear in the way they smiled at Mike's cooking or patted Lily on the head as she zipped by with a tray. Others, like Hank, made no effort to hide their disdain. One afternoon, Hank strolled in with a group of men I hadn't seen before. They took a booth in the corner, their conversation hushed but their glances toward Mike anything but subtle. I could feel their judgment like a physical weight pressing against the walls of the diner. As I refilled Hank's coffee, he leaned back in his chair and nodded toward the kitchen. "You still got him working back there?" "His name's Mike," I replied, my voice even but firm. "And yeah, he's still here." Hank snorted. "Figured as much. Thought maybe you'd wise up by now." I gritted my teeth. "If you've got a problem with how I run this place, you know where the door is." His smirk faded, and for a moment, I thought he might get up and leave. Instead, he just shook his head and muttered something under his breath. The men with him exchanged glances but stayed silent. I turned and walked away, my hands trembling with suppressed anger. When Mike emerged from the kitchen a few minutes later, his face was calm, but I could see the tension in his eyes. "Don't let them get to you," he said quietly. "Easier said than done," I replied, glancing over my shoulder at the booth where Hank and his friends were still sitting. "They're trying to scare us off." "They won't," Mike said with quiet conviction. "We've come too far." Later that evening, as the diner emptied out and the hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet, Mike approached me with an idea. "We need to do something to show people what this place is really about," he said, his hands resting on the counter. "Not just good food, but community. A reason for them to come together." I raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about an event? Something like that?" "Yeah," Mike said, nodding. "A community dinner. Free meals for anyone who shows up. No strings attached." I leaned back against the counter, crossing my arms. You realize how much that'll cost. Right. We're barely keeping the lights on as it is. Mike met my gaze steadily. It's a risk. But if it works, it could turn things around. People need to see what we're trying to do here. His words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. I thought about the empty booths that had once been filled with laughter and conversation. The regulars who had stopped coming. And the graffiti we'd scrubbed off the walls. He was right. We needed to show the neighborhood that this diner was more than just a place to eat, it was a place to belong. All right, I said finally, the decision settling in my chest like a weight I was willing to carry. Let's do it. Mike's face lit up with a mixture of relief and determination. You won't regret it. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Mike worked late into the night, planning the menu and gathering ingredients. Lily took it upon herself to make colorful posters advertising the dinner. Her excitement contagious as she taped them up in the windows and around the neighborhood. When the evening of the dinner arrived, I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me feared that no one would show up, that the event would be a failure and we'd be left with more bills and fewer allies. But as the clock struck 6, people began to trickle in, families, couples, even a few regulars who hadn't been by in weeks. The atmosphere in the diner was electric. A hum of conversation and laughter filling the air as plates of food left the kitchen. Mike was in his element, moving with a practiced ease that belied the chaos around him. Lily darted from table to table, her bright smile a beacon of warmth for everyone who walked through the door. By the time the evening was over, the diner was packed. The tables full of people eating, talking, and sharing stories. For the first time in years, the place felt alive, buzzing with the energy of a community coming together. As the last guests trickled out, I leaned against the counter, watching Mike emerge from the kitchen. His apron was stained, his hair slightly disheveled, but the smile on his face was one of pure satisfaction. We did it, he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Yeah, I replied, a rare smile tugging at my lips. We did. Lily appeared beside us, her eyes wide with excitement. Can we do it again? Mr. Jake? Please. I chuckled, ruffling her hair. We'll see. Kid. We'll see. That night, as I locked up the diner, the weight that had been pressing down on me for months felt just a little lighter. The fight wasn't over, I knew that much. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. The morning after the community dinner, the diner felt different. The air seemed lighter. The tension that had clung to the walls for weeks now replaced with a cautious optimism. The tables, once half empty, were now bustling with customers, some of whom had never set foot in Jake's classic eats before. People smiled more, their conversations warm and familiar as they greeted neighbors they hadn't seen in years. I stood behind the counter, sipping my coffee and watching the scene unfold. It was a sight I hadn't seen in what felt like forever, a diner alive with energy and purpose. Mike was already in the kitchen, prepping ingredients for the day, while Lily busied herself setting out napkins and silverware with the same meticulous care she brought to everything she did. Morning. Mr. Jake, she chirped as she passed by, balancing a small stack of plates. Morning. Kid. I replied, unable to suppress a grin. Her cheerfulness was infectious, a bright spot in an otherwise complicated world. Mike emerged from the kitchen a moment later, wiping his hands on a towel. We're running low on eggs and flour, he said, his voice calm but tinged with concern. I can make it through the morning, but we'll need more by the afternoon. I nodded, making a mental note to call the supplier. I'll take care of it. Don't worry. Mike gave a small nod and disappeared back into the kitchen. But I could sense the weight on his shoulders. Despite the success of the community dinner, there was no denying that we were still walking a tightrope. The influx of customers was promising, but the financial strain hadn't disappeared overnight. The doorbell jingled, drawing my attention to the entrance. Emma. The local reporter who had covered the community dinner stepped inside, her notepad and camera bag slung over her shoulder. Her smile was bright as she approached the counter. "Morning, Jake," she said, pulling up a stool. "Looks like the dinner was a hit. People are still talking about it." "It went better than I expected," I admitted, setting down my coffee cup. "What brings you in today?" "Follow-up story," she said, flipping open her notepad. "People loved the first article. And now they want to know more about you, Mike. And the diner. I think you've got something special here." I hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where Mike was hard at work. "We're just trying to keep the lights on, Emma. Nothing fancy." Emma laughed. "That's exactly why people care. It's a story about resilience, second chances, and community. That's something people want to read about." Her words stuck with me long after she left. The idea that the diner could be more than just a place to grab a meal, it could be a symbol of something greater, was both humbling and overwhelming. But as I watched customers linger at their tables, chatting and laughing, I couldn't deny the truth in her observation. By midday, the diner was busier than it had been in years. Mike worked tirelessly in the kitchen, his focus unshakable, while Lily darted between tables with the energy of someone twice her size. I moved from table to table, refilling drinks and taking orders, my movements instinctive after years of practice. But not everyone was here to support us. A group of teenagers loitered near the door, their laughter sharp and mocking as they watched the diner's activity. One of them leaned against the glass, smirking as he caught sight of Mike through the pass-through window. "Nice place you've got here," the boy said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Real welcoming." I set down the coffee pot I was holding and walked over, my steps deliberate. "You need something? Or are you just here to make trouble?" The boy shrugged, his smirk never wavering. "Just looking." "Well, look somewhere else," I said firmly, my gaze steady. The boy hesitated, then turned and walked away, his friends trailing behind him. But their laughter echoed in my ears long after they were gone, a bitter reminder that not everyone in the neighborhood was ready to embrace change. That evening, as we prepared to close up, Mike approached me with a tired but determined expression. "We're making progress," he said, gesturing toward the now empty diner. "But it's still going to be a fight." I nodded, leaning against the counter. "I know. But we're in it now. And we're not backing down." Mike's lips curved into a faint smile. "I never thought I'd be part of something like this again." "You belong here, Mike," I said, surprising even myself with the conviction in my voice. "You and Lily both." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before nodding. "Thanks, Jake. That means a lot." As he headed back to the kitchen to clean up, I glanced out the window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade into the horizon. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The threats, the stares, the whispers, they were all still there, lingering like a shadow over everything we'd built. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was fighting alone. Mike and Lily had become more than just temporary guests, they were part of the diner's story now, part of its future. And together, we were going to make sure that future was one worth fighting for. The diner had found its rhythm again. The once lonely space was now alive with the chatter of customers, the clatter of plates, and the occasional burst of laughter from Lily as she darted between tables. Mike's cooking had become the talk of the neighborhood, drawing in curious faces who stayed for the food and left with stories to share. But success, as I was quickly learning, came with its own set of challenges. It started subtly, sideways glances from a few regulars, whispers that stopped the moment I walked by, and then it escalated. One evening, as I locked up, I found a note taped to the front door. The words were simple but laced with venom: "You don't belong here." I stood there for a moment, the paper crumpling in my fist as anger surged through me. This wasn't just about Mike and Lily anymore. It was about the diner, about everything it stood for. I refused to let anyone tear that down. The next morning, I found Mike in the kitchen, carefully slicing vegetables with the focus of someone trying to block out the world. "We should call the police," he said when I showed him the note. "And what?" I countered, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "Wait for them to do nothing? No, we handle this ourselves." Mike frowned but didn't argue. I knew he understood the futility of relying on outside help. We had to be our own defense. That day, I decided we weren't just going to survive, we were going to thrive. I announced our next event, a live music night. It was Lily's idea. Of course. People love music, she had said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. And I can sing. Mr. Jake. At first, I dismissed the suggestion as one of her wild ideas. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Music had a way of bringing people together, of breaking down barriers in a way that words couldn't. Mike was hesitant. "What if it backfires?" he asked as we planned the event one evening. "It's a risk," I admitted. "But so is doing nothing. We've come this far. Let's see how far we can go." The night of the event arrived, and the diner was packed. Tables were filled with families, couples, and even a few reporters Emma had invited. The air buzzed with anticipation as a local guitarist began to play. The soft strumming of his acoustic guitar filled the room, blending seamlessly with the hum of conversation. And then Lily took the stage. She stood there, small but confident, the microphone almost too big for her hands. "This song is for everyone who believed in us," she said, her voice clear and steady. And then she began to sing. Her voice was pure, unpolished but full of emotion. She sang with a sincerity that silenced the room, drawing everyone in. For those few minutes, the diner wasn't just a place to eat, it was a sanctuary, a reminder of what community could be. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. I glanced at Mike, who was standing near the pass-through window, his expression a mix of pride and disbelief. "She's amazing," he murmured. "Yeah," I agreed, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in my chest. "She is." But not everyone in the room was celebrating. In the corner, I spotted Rick, one of Hank's friends, leaning against the wall with a sour expression. His eyes were fixed on Mike, his disdain as clear as day. After the crowd began to thin out, Rick approached me. "You really think this changes anything?" he sneered. "You're letting him ruin this place." I took a step closer, my voice low and firm. "Mike's the reason this place is still standing. If you've got a problem with that, you know where the door is." Rick's smirk faltered, but he didn't back down. "This isn't over, Jake." "Maybe not," I replied. "But neither are we." He left, slamming the door behind him. I exhaled slowly, my hands trembling with adrenaline. Mike joined me at the counter, his face unreadable. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Yes, I did," I replied. "We're in this together, Mike. And I'm not letting anyone tear us apart." The days that followed were a mix of triumph and tension. Customers came in droves, drawn by Emma's glowing article about the event and Lily's impromptu performance. But the threats didn't stop. More notes appeared on the door, and one morning, I found another graffiti-covered wall. Lily's usual cheerfulness began to waver, her questions becoming harder to answer. "Why do they hate us, Mr. Jake?" she asked one evening as we closed up. I crouched down to her level, meeting her wide, uncertain eyes. "Because they don't understand," I said gently. "But that's not your fault. And it's not your dad's fault either. Sometimes, people are scared of what they don't know." She nodded slowly, though her small hands still gripped the edge of her dress tightly. "Are we going to be okay?" I placed a hand on her shoulder, my voice steady despite the doubt gnawing at me. "Yeah, kid. We're going to be okay." That night, as I sat in the empty diner, the echoes of Lily's song still ringing in my ears, I knew we had a long road ahead. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. We weren't just fighting for the diner anymore. We were fighting for each other. And that, I realized, was worth every risk. The days after the music night were some of the busiest the diner had seen in years. Customers filled every booth, and the air was alive with the sound of chatter and laughter. Emma's article had worked wonders, drawing in curious faces from across the neighborhood. For the first time in a long while, I dared to feel hopeful. But the success came with a shadow. Each morning, I approached the diner's door half expecting another hateful note or a fresh spray of graffiti. And though business was booming, the tension lingered. A quiet but persistent reminder that not everyone in the neighborhood supported the changes we were making. One evening, as we were winding down after a particularly hectic day, Mike sat across from me at the counter, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Lily had already fallen asleep in one of the booths. Her small frame curled up under a blanket she insisted on bringing everywhere. "We're doing good," Mike said, his voice low but resolute. "But I can't help feeling like we're on borrowed time." I frowned, setting my coffee cup down. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the countertop. "Rick, Hank, and their crowd, they're not going to stop. They'll keep pushing, trying to scare us off. They're just bullies," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We've faced worse." Mike looked up, his eyes heavy with worry. "I've seen this before, Jake. People like them don't just stop. They'll keep coming until they get what they want. And what they want," I said firmly, "is for us to give up. That's not happening." Mike studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. If you're in, so am I." That night, I couldn't sleep. The words on the hateful notes replayed in my mind, mingling with the memories of the shattered window and the whispers from customers who still weren't sure what to make of the changes. But I also thought of Lily's song, the way it had silenced the diner and brought people together, even if only for a moment. That was what we were fighting for, and I wasn't about to let it go. The next morning, I arrived at the diner early to find something that stopped me in my tracks. The front window, freshly repaired just weeks ago, was shattered again. A brick lay amidst the shards of glass. A note taped to it that read, "This place isn't for you." I clenched my fists, anger and exhaustion swirling in my chest. This wasn't just vandalism, it was a message. And I hated that it was working, even just a little. When Mike arrived, his expression darkened as he took in the damage. Lily followed close behind, her small hand gripping the edge of his jacket. "Not again," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's okay, kid," I said, crouching down to meet her eyes. "We'll fix it, just like we did last time." "But what if they break it again?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. "They might," I admitted. "But every time they do, we'll fix it. Because this is our place. And no one's going to take it from us." She nodded slowly, her small frame trembling. Mike placed a hand on her shoulder, his jaw tight. "I'll help clean up," he said quietly. The three of us spent the morning sweeping up glass and patching the window with plywood. Customers came and went, some offering words of support, others avoiding eye contact altogether. The damage felt like a physical wound. But as the day wore on, I realized something else. Each person who walked through the door was a reminder that we weren't alone. That evening, as we locked up, Emma stopped by, her camera slung over her shoulder. She took one look at the boarded-up window and shook her head. "It's time to make this public," she said. "Let people see what's happening here." Mike frowned. "Won't that just make things worse?" "It might," Emma admitted. "But it could also bring more people to your side. This diner isn't just about food anymore, it's about standing up for something. People need to see that." I hesitated, the weight of her words settling in my chest. She was right. This was bigger than just us now. It was about the neighborhood, about the idea that everyone deserved a chance to belong. "Do it," I said finally. Tell the story. Emma smiled, her determination clear. You won't regret it. The article came out the next day, complete with photos of the shattered window and quotes from Mike and me. It didn't take long for the response to pour in. Donations arrived in the form of money, supplies, and even offers to help with repairs. Customers lined up outside the diner, eager to show their support. But the threats didn't stop. One evening, as I was closing up, Rick showed up again, leaning against the doorway with a smug grin. Enjoying your 15 minutes, he sneered. It won't last. I stepped closer, my voice calm but firm. You've got something to say, Rick. Just that people don't forget. Jake, he said, his tone icy. And they don't forgive. I didn't flinch. You're right. People don't forget. They remember the ones who stand up for what's right. And they'll remember you too. He left without another word. But the tension in my chest lingered long after the door closed behind him. As I sat at the counter that night, staring out at the quiet street, I thought about everything we'd been through. The vandalism, the hate, the whispers. They were all reminders of how much work was left to do. But they were also proof that we were making a difference. And as long as Mike, Lily, and I stood together, I knew we could face whatever came next. The diner wasn't just surviving anymore, it was thriving. And together, we were proving that change wasn't just possible, it was worth fighting for. As the months passed, Jake's Classic Eats transformed into more than just a diner. It became a cornerstone of the community. The graffiti and broken windows became distant memories, replaced by laughter, music, and the steady hum of customers who believed in what the diner represented. Mike's cooking gained a reputation that extended far beyond the neighborhood, and Lily's energy never wavered as she greeted every guest with a smile. The journey wasn't easy. There were still challenges. But the fight to belong had brought Jake, Mike, and Lily closer together. They weren't just running a business, they were building a family. The diner, now officially renamed Jake and Mike's Classic Eats, was a beacon of hope, proving that kindness and resilience could overcome even the deepest divides. One evening, as the sun set over the bustling diner, Jake stood behind the counter, watching Mike and Lily laugh with a table of customers. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. The fight had been worth it. Thank you for watching this story of resilience, love, and second chances. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales of humanity and hope. See you in the next video.